Have you ever wondered about this question that's been kicking around for a long time? Why can't we all just get along? Have you ever wondered why there are some people you just can't agree with? You can't even have a conversation with them because whatever you say, they can feel so threatened by it that they either close you off or they start attacking you. So you can't even carry on a conversation with them. Have you ever wondered why there's conflict in the world, warfare, torture, why people do these completely inhumane things to each other? Well, if you have, then by looking at the previous videos, you have gotten a foundation for understanding this. It's the duality consciousness. If a person is completely trapped in a duality consciousness, as I've explained, then that person has a certain viewpoint, a certain worldview. And the person has adapted this because the person believes that it's a superior, it's the ultimate truth. But it also feels threatened, even though it's sure that it has the ultimate truth. The person still feels threatened by anything that questions its ultimate truth. And that's why as soon as you say something that the person doesn't like or that seems to invalidate the person's beliefs, the person feels threatened and they start attacking you. To simply divert attention away from itself. If you think about it, when somebody's attacking you, it's really because you have said something that really means that the person has to look at itself and its beliefs and come to see that maybe they are not the ultimate truth, or maybe they are even contradictory. But the person doesn't want to look at itself, so it's projecting out that the problem is you. So this is what you see as is the basic dynamic for why there's so much conflict in the world. People feel they have an absolute truth, but they still feel threatened, and when they feel threatened, they always project out that the problem is out there. It's other people that are the problem. They are the ones who have to change. I don't have to change. So this is a dynamic you can see in people. And it can be explained by the duality consciousness because there's always two opposite extremes, as I said. And when you go into duality, you will polarize towards one and elevate that to the status of being absolute. But even though you think that your truth is absolute, your truth doesn't exist independently. It doesn't exist on its own. It exists in a polarity with its opposite. So your ultimate truth is always threatened by some lie. So you see, you can't escape. When you go into duality, you cannot escape feeling threatened by opposites. And that's why you see so many people who are, it's like they're constantly threatened. And why is that? Well, you can actually see people who, they're not completely trapped in duality because they will change their opinions over time. So you can see some people who, over a period of time, they have given up certain viewpoints they used to hold. So when they were younger, they had certain viewpoints. Now they're giving them up. Now they're holding almost the opposite viewpoint. So it's like these people, they are willing to look at the specifics of what they believe, the specifics of their worldview. But what I've said in previous talks is that what duality really gives you is this sense that you can't be wrong. You're right. And even though the specifics of your viewpoint might change, people can still preserve this, I can't be wrong. And that means they're still trapped in duality. And so what I'm going to do here is we're going to talk a little bit about this. Where does this come from? And really one way to explain it is this concept that's become more common in psychological circles over the last 10, 20 years. And it's called cognitive dissonance. And it's commonly explained that people are holding two opposing viewpoints, and it gives a tension, or they have a certain viewpoint that contradicts their actions. And there are many real-life examples of this, but just take one. You cannot have grown up in today's world without having been exposed to the fact that smoking is dangerous to your health. Yet there are still people who smoke. And to my surprise, there are many young people who smoke. I mean, when I grew up, nobody really knew that smoking was dangerous when I was a child, so people were just smoking. So you could say there was an older generation that hadn't grown up with this. But today, young people have grown up knowing that smoking is dangerous, they still smoke. So the thing is, in your mind, you have to rationalize why either smoking isn't dangerous, as they say, or it's not going to be dangerous for you. It's not going to affect you. And this is one example of how the dualistic mind, as I said, can justify anything. It can really validate any viewpoint. And you might know a person who smokes, and you might give them the facts based on studies and knowing people that died because of smoking. But as I said, these people, cognitive dissonance, it's the perception filter. You are telling them something, but their minds, their subconscious minds, are just filtering it out. It's not that it's filtering out what you're saying, but it's filtering out as not valid. Because these people have created a subconscious filter that says, I can't be wrong about smoking. It's okay for me to smoke. And that filter filters out any threat to them smoking. And when we begin to see this, well, first of all, we can save ourselves a lot of agony by saying there are certain people, there's no point in even trying to convince them. But the other thing we can do is we can begin to understand that this perception filter that I'm talking about is really a major feature of these subconscious selves. Every subconscious self that I've talked about has a perception filter. But I've also talked about there's like an overall separate self that we can talk about, which we can call the ego, and which is like the umbrella, and all the specific subconscious selves fit into it. And the ego is really the subconscious self that sees you as a separate being. And as I've explained, when you go into separation, you will feel a loss because you've lost your connection to your higher self. You really lost the connection to who you are. You don't know who you are anymore. And you feel alone, you feel bereft, you feel deprived. There's something missing. And there is. What is missing is the connection to a higher self. But the ego, of course, can't handle that because the ego needs you to think that it can give you what you need so that you don't look back for the connection to a higher self. Because the ego has some awareness that if you reconnect to a higher self, it will be on the losing end. So as long as you are disconnected from your higher self, the ego has control over you, and therefore you keep feeding it energy and it will survive and possibly even get stronger. So because the loss of contact with your higher self was a loss, your ego has to distract your attention from this and make you believe that you can get everything you need in this world. And this means the ego then goes into this state of mind that it cannot be wrong. Because if it was proven wrong, you wouldn't believe in it anymore. But you see how this is a losing battle. It's an impossible quest because the ego, as I said, can only see duality. Just think about this. The ego, the separate ego. I'm not talking about the sense of self that allows you to be embodiment on earth. Because you have a sense of self even when you are connected. But when you go into separation, that's when you create the ego. And the ego can only see the duality consciousness because it's created out of the duality consciousness. It does not have self-awareness like the conscious you does. And therefore the ego cannot step back and say, is there an alternative to duality? Should I just cease to exist? No, the ego is like a computer, can only keep doing its programming. So the ego seeks to convince you that it can give you everything you need in this world by selecting one of the dualistic polarities, like one belief system, like Christianity. If you're a good Christian, you're guaranteed to be saved. So therefore you don't need to feel that you've lost anything. Maybe you feel you have lost something in this world, but after you die, you'll go to heaven and everything will be wonderful. And that's why the ego can't handle if your belief, say Christianity, is threatened. And that's why you see so many people who get very, very upset, very, very angry if they feel their Christian beliefs are threatened. Now you see this with many other beliefs, of course. When I was young and went to college, I met some Marxists that were very threatened if their Marxist beliefs were questioned. Or just even that fact that I didn't share them made them feel threatened. And I met others, scientific materialism, this political party, that political party, you know, this president, that president, all kinds of viewpoints that people have. And what you can simply learn to see is that if people feel threatened when someone or something questions their beliefs, this is ego. This comes from this basic dynamic that they have taken one relative dualistic viewpoint, elevated it to the status of infallibility, and therefore they are automatically threatened by anything that questions that viewpoint, because if a viewpoint is infallible, it can't be questioned, right? Let me just give you a historical example of this. In the 1500s, the dominant, what do you want to call it? Well, the dominant thought system in Europe was the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church had projected that it was the only road to salvation. Only if people were members of the Catholic Church and followed the Catholic Church could they be saved. And it had also projected that in order to be saved, you had to believe in the Catholic Church's doctrines, and you have to believe that those doctrines were infallible. So what you had this projection: the Catholic Church, all of its doctrines are infallible because they come from the highest source, because the Pope is the vicar of Christ and he speaks directly to the highest source. So they are infallible. Now they had a specific doctrine that said the earth is the center of the universe. Because when you look up in the sky, you can see that the stars and the moon, they are moving, and it seems they are moving relative to the earth. So based on this sensory perception, they had formulated this doctrine: the earth is the center of the universe. But then some astronomers, Kepler, Galileo, started building telescopes, and they started observing the stars and writing down their observations very carefully. And they started saying, you know, it doesn't actually look like all the stars and the planets are moving around the earth. It actually looks more like the earth is moving around the sun. Now you could say, if you ask yourself, why would the Catholic Church be opposed to this? I mean, today, I think most people will probably look back at this and say, but hey, we accept today that the earth is not the center of the universe, that the earth is moving around the sun. What was the big deal? Why didn't the Catholic Church just accept this? Why do they go into this extreme of persecuting these astronomers as heretics and putting Galileo in house arrest and making him recant his heretical beliefs and all this stuff? Well, they did it for this simple reason. They had a specific doctrine saying the earth is the center of the universe, but they had an overall doctrine saying all Catholic doctrines are infallible. And if one aspect of Catholic doctrine was proven wrong, it would raise questions about the infallibility of all the doctrines and the Catholic Church. So you see, this is typical of the duality consciousness. When you go into this, black and white thinking. It's all or nothing. Either you are completely infallible or you're completely wrong. There's nothing in between. I mean, you're up here on the pedestal one moment and then you fall to the lowest level the next. And that's why the Catholic Church had to defend not that particular doctrine, but its aura of infallibility And that's why you had the Inquisition and Crusades and witch hunts and persecution of scientists and all this stuff that we can today look back at and say, how could this ever happen? But now you see why it happened. And so what we have to realize here about this, if we are spiritual people, is that the ego is by its very nature, it's schizophrenic. The ego has cognitive dissonance. And what do I mean with this? Well, let's take smoking. You know that smoking can be dangerous to your health. But in your mind, you have created this subconscious self, this perception filter that says, but it's not going to hit me. I know many people who live to be 90 and they smoked all their lives and they never got sick. So this is a belief you have, and it must be seen as infallible, because otherwise, you would feel really bad about having smoked all these years. So now the ego cannot help but go into cognitive dissonance. Because whenever you hear evidence, or even you hear about someone who died from smoking-related illness, you have to create a new perception filter that denies, for example, that these people died, or that smoking is dangerous. So you're always in this state of denial, and it's like one denial leads to another, and you may end up going around where you actually have contradictory viewpoints. You may have, as one example, you have people who feel, I'm very healthy and I'm very concerned about health, but you're still smoking because that isn't going to affect my health. So you see what I'm saying? The ego, it's almost like the ego is caught in this ping-pong match between the two dualistic extremes, where it has based its sense of infallibility on a certain thought system. Let's say, again, it's Christianity. Christianity is the only true religion, and I'm guaranteed to be saved as long as I'm a good Christian. But the validity of Christianity is constantly being challenged by other religions, by science, by spirituality, and even by contradictions in Christian viewpoints and doctrines. So the ego is constantly threatened, and it's constantly having to defend its main viewpoint, because if Christianity was proven wrong, the ego's sense of infallibility would be proven wrong, and then you, the conscious you, might wake up from your identification with the ego and start really questioning, am I the ego, or am I more than the ego? Can I ever really be satisfied by anything in this world? Or can I only be satisfied if I reconnect to my higher self? These are questions the ego does not want you to ask, and that's why it's frantically trying to defend specific viewpoints, but it's really just doing that in order to defend its own aura of infallibility, so you keep believing that the ego is infallible. And there came a point, it's a number of years ago, where I saw this. I'm not saying I understood it intellectually, which I did, but beyond the intellectual understanding, I actually saw it in like an intuitive vision. It was like it was like, to use the vocabulary I'm using here, the conscious you, my conscious you, stepped outside of my four lower bodies, and I saw that even my involvement with the spiritual path had been driven by this ego desire, where I was using a spiritual teaching to prove the infallibility of my ego and the superiority, because my ego could, or I could, recognize this very advanced spiritual teaching, and therefore I had to be an advanced spiritual student, and therefore I had to be guaranteed to be saved, which wasn't the vocabulary I used, but anyway. And I just saw it. I saw this, And you could say that was an awakening experience. But it didn't mean that I had no ego left, that I had no dualistic beliefs yet, left. It meant that I had really turned a corner on the spiritual path, where I had started becoming more consciously aware of the ego and its effects and how subtle it is. But I still had many dualistic beliefs, many of these subconscious selves, that I needed to see one at a time and unravel one at a time. And honestly, I think this process is still ongoing, because every once in a while I will see one of these dualistic selves and have to deal with it and really come to see it and separate myself from it and let it die. So what I'm trying to say with this is that as spiritual people, this teaching can be extremely helpful for us. First of all, it can help us understand, as I said, what's going on in the world and why there are some people you just can't reason with, you can't even talk to. And you can really say, why should I then? If I can see that I can't help these people because they're trapped behind their perception filter and they won't question it, why should I spend my time and energy on trying to convince these people when there might be other people that I could help? But the other thing is that for your own growth, you can come to see that you need, if you really want to grow spiritually, you need to be willing to look at your own perception filters. Look at these subconscious selves, because you can look at it this way, that you can have subconscious selves that are created in different situations, difficult situations on earth. They might be created in different lifetimes, for example, where you don't remember why they were created. So you can very well have two subconscious selves that are actually holding opposite viewpoints. That one is polarized towards one dualistic extreme, the other is polarized towards the other. And, it can create all kinds of tension and stress in your mind that you haven't seen this. Because you're constantly feeling stressed because you intuitively sense there's something in your psychology that isn't resolved. And maybe you even notice how you're ping-ponging back and forth, you're swinging back and forth, even your behavior can be erratic, but especially your beliefs can be erratic. And so once you realize that this is just ego, this is just these subconscious selves, and they're not who you are, and all you need to do is really bring them out of the subconscious hiding place so you can see them, see that they're not you, see that they're based on an illusion. And when you see that a self is based on an illusion, you also see the higher reality. And, what do? You let go of the illusion. It's like you can say you're walking in the dark and you find something and you grab a hold of it and you think it's a rope. But then you get out in the light and you see it's a snake. But the moment you see it's a snake, do you have to intellectually think, oh yeah, maybe I should let go of the snake? No, you just let go of the snake. And it's the same thing. The moment you see an illusion, you see that it's an illusion, you see it's limiting you, you just let go of it. And you have now resolved the subconscious self and you have reduced the tension in your mind. And that's essentially, all talk about the spiritual path. This is the essence of the spiritual path, is resolving these, I call them subconscious selves, but they're really the contradictions, the illusions that we have in our minds. And again, there's no reason to blame yourself for having this, because when you realize that reincarnation is real, when you realize that Earth is a very difficult planet, I've explained this in several videos, it's an unnatural planet, and you realize you've been in embodiment here many times, you see that you can't avoid being exposed to many difficult situations. And that's why, when I realized this, I could say, okay, it was like this, it was like this enormous relief for me, because what I realized was, you see what I just said? My ego projected that it was infallible. But I was rational enough, logical enough to see that I had certain inconsistencies in my beliefs. I didn't call it cognitive dissonance back then, but I could see that sometimes I had contradictory viewpoints. But I was reluctant to admit this because, again, if my ego was proven wrong in one particular aspect, perhaps its claim to infallibility was wrong, and I would fall from up there to down here, and I couldn't bear this psychologically. So I was in a catch-22 where I projected that, oh, I'm an advanced spiritual student. But as an advanced spiritual student, another self was projecting, I shouldn't have contradictory viewpoints, I should be consistent. And suddenly I was reluctant to admit that I had inconsistent viewpoints. But the inconsistent viewpoints gave me a constant stress because, I was ping-ponging between one self and another self. And there was no way out of this stress. It actually became more and more intense. Even when I started spiritual teachings, it in a sense made it worse because now I had more knowledge of spiritual concepts, so I could see that some of my previous viewpoints were not the highest possible, they were wrong. But it was hard to admit that they were wrong because the whole self-justification process of the ego. So when I saw this and saw the vanity of this, the impossibility of it, it became so much easier for me to say, oh, but this is not really me. These are just viewpoints I've come to hold. And the sooner I see them and let them go, the better I'm going to feel about myself, the more at peace I'm going to feel. And so you see what happened to me, what I'm trying to explain here, and this is something I went through it myself. I've seen many other people on the spiritual path go through it when they get these teachings that I am bringing out here. And it's the most important shift you can make, because what I'm saying is, as long as you are identified with the ego and its need for infallibility, you are under constant stress. You can't admit that you were wrong. You can't free yourself from the stress, because seeing that a particular viewpoint is either wrong or not the highest possible is a threat to you, to your sense of security, basically. It's based on the sense of infallibility. But it really gives you a sense of security. So new ideas that contradict your old or go beyond your old are a threat to you. And this is a very hard place to be in if you're a spiritual person, because what's the idea of spirituality? It is, think about this, okay? We all grew up with certain beliefs about life. And we might have been affected by a specific religion like Christianity, and most of us were also affected by scientific materialism. And of course you can say right there is a cognitive dissonance, right? Christianity says there is a God, materialism says there's no God. They're incompatible viewpoints here. But we were exposed to both of them, and we had to find some way to balance the two, right? And some people did it by clinging to Christianity, other people did it by clinging to materialism, but as spiritual people, we found some middle ground. We are not Christians, we don't see ourselves as Christians, we don't believe in the Christian doctrines, we don't believe they're infallible. But we don't see ourselves as materialists either, because we believe there is something beyond the material world. So you see what I'm saying? As spiritual people, the very fact that we have grown up in this culture that's divided between religion and materialism, we have sort of taken on a certain cognitive dissonance. And the whole idea of walking the spiritual path is that we can increase our awareness and understanding of the spiritual side to life. And the spiritual side to life is something, it's beyond the Christian doctrines, because they're outer man-made doctrines in this world, and it's beyond materialism because they're also outer man-made doctrines in this world. So we believe as spiritual people there is something beyond those two. There's something beyond this world. But you see, this very idea, there's something beyond this world, is a fundamental existential threat to the ego. So you see what I'm saying? You've been on the spiritual path probably for many years before you found this video. This entire time, your ego has been threatened by this. And it's been trying to get you to hold on to some of the beliefs that you had before you found the spiritual path. Christianity, materialism, many other things, many subtle things. And what has happened to many people, as I said, what happened to me before I had this breakthrough was that every time I came across a new idea, my ego would see it as a threat. Especially if it affected how I looked at myself as being an advanced spiritual student who could understand everything and who didn't have contradictory viewpoints. And when I saw this and let this go, all of a sudden, coming to a new understanding was no longer a threat to me. It was still a threat to my ego, what's left of it, but it was not a threat to me. And that meant I could embrace getting this understanding. And what this specific means, I'm not just talking about outer viewpoints here, because what have I said? I've said, you have a specific viewpoint. And let's just take an example. You're brought up with Christianity. And Christianity portrays there's this angry God up there in the sky who is looking down on you and evaluating everything you do and say and think. And if you do the wrong things, you're going to go to hell. And you have created a subconscious self that believes this. And if you come across a spiritual teaching that questions the existence of this God, your ego is going to, this subconscious self that you have is going to feel very threatened. I had this subconscious self myself. And I remember when I first started thinking, maybe this Old Testament God isn't real. Maybe it's a man-made God. This self raised its head like a lion and felt very threatened. So what I'm trying to say with this is it's not just a matter of your viewpoints. There is a separate self here that doesn't want you to question specific viewpoints. And it's only really when you come to see this, see that the self is based on illusion, admit that it's an illusion, and let go of the illusion. It's only really then that the self dies. It loses its grip over you. But what does this mean? In order to discover these selves, what do you have to be willing to do? You have to be willing to look at yourself, your own subconscious mind, your own psychology. And you have to look for things that are unresolved, because they are these selves that are based on an illusion. And the self clings blindly to the illusion. You must not come to see that the illusion is an illusion. And therefore the self will resist you coming to that. And that means that what you can now admit consciously is that so far your spiritual path has been this uphill battle, really. Because it's like there's resistance. Every time you take a step, there's a resistance. I have used this illustration before that you're climbing a mountain, a steep hillside. But you have 10 boat anchors dragging behind you in ropes. So for every step you have to pull these anchors, and they constantly get stuck on tree roots and rocks and this and that. But if you could turn around and see, oh, there's a rope and it's tied to something, and you could cut the rope, it would be easier to climb the hill, and the more ropes you cut, the easier it becomes. So you see what I'm saying? That for me, there was a point on the spiritual path. Now, I've been on the spiritual path for quite a few years before I realized this. There's a point on the spiritual path where I realized I have been dragging all this resistance, all this dead weight behind me as I was thinking. I was climbing the spiritual path as fast as I could. And I was thinking this because I was studying these outer teachings, I was doing these outer practices. Surely I was a good spiritual student. I was making progress as fast as I could. But what I realized was, no. Because my own psychology is the boat anchors that are dragging behind me, slowing down my growth. It's like you were taking one step forward, you slide 2 steps backwards. And so you're not making this constant steady progress. It's kind of, And when I saw this, when I realized this, it didn't mean that all the boat anchors were gone. It meant my resistance to looking at my psychology was at least reduced drastically. And I became willing to constantly ask the question, is there something in my psychology I haven't seen and haven't resolved? Which I hadn't really asked before. I hadn't been aware of it. But I hadn't really dared to ask it because I was too identified with the egos wanting to always be an advanced student. So if I'm really an advanced student, I shouldn't have anything really bad in my psychology that wasn't resolved. And in order to avoid that, I was not willing to look at my psychology. I'd rather have it stay hidden. And this is what I've talked about in several of my breakthrough videos. There's many people, when we first find some spiritual teaching, we lock into the outer path, where we think that studying the outer teaching, listening to the guru, doing the practices, that's enough for us to make spiritual progress. And then it's a shift when we realize, no, there is an inner path beyond the outer path, and that's where we really make progress. And the inner path is all about one thing, resolving psychology. Resolving these subconscious selves that are contradictory, that have cognitive dissonance. You see, I wanted to make maximum spiritual progress. The only way to make progress is to cut the ropes to the boat anchor so I'm not dragging them behind me. But the only way to cut the rope is to see that there is a rope and see what the illusion is. I have to see the self and see the illusion behind it. And in order to see that, I have to look into this scary place, the subconscious mind. And for years on the spiritual path, I wasn't willing to look because I needed to feel I was an advanced spiritual student. And as such, I shouldn't have any cognitive dissonance, any contradictory beliefs, any unresolved psychology. So you see how at the conscious level, I had the desire to make maximum progress, but I wasn't willing to look at the fact that I had subconscious resistance to making maximum progress. And it was only when I saw this and consciously decided that I was willing to look that I started making faster progress. Now, mind you, this doesn't mean that because I decided, oh yeah, I'm willing to look at my psychology, it doesn't mean that all of these subconscious selves came roaring out like a multi-headed dragon all at once. I only saw one subconscious self at a time, sometimes two that were paired, but it all happened in stages, and it's still happening in stages. That's why it's not so scary, it's not so overwhelming. And I, of course, knew about Ascended Master teaching, so if I made this shift, I was asking the Masters to help me see these subconscious selves. And they show you what you are ready to deal with. They don't show you it all at once, because they're not seeking to overwhelm you or discourage you. They show you what you need to deal with now to take the next step up. And then the next self that helps you take that step up, and so forth. And this has been going on now since I really had that shift in 2002. That's when I really saw the need to look at my psychology. It was not that I hadn't worked on my psychology before, because I actually started going to therapy in the early 1990s. But I still hadn't locked into the need to really look at myself, and that happened in 2002. And ever since then, I have overcome many of these subconscious selves. But I still don't see myself as having no subconscious selves left, because on a weekly basis I see something in my psychology, sometimes on a daily basis. And that's because I have given up the self that I have to be infallible, that I have to be an advanced spiritual student that doesn't have unresolved psychology. You see? This is a trap, and I've seen spiritual people go in it. I even see some of these non-dual teachers. I see other spiritual gurus that have set themselves up as gurus, and they make this claim. I am awakened, I'm enlightened, I'm an advanced spiritual guru, I'm the embodiment of this deity, and therefore I have no unresolved psychology. And what does that do then? That means now you think you don't have to look anymore. So how are you going to resolve what's left if you're not looking, and if you think it's not there? That is when the ego, even if a person has been on the spiritual path for many years, you can have been on the spiritual path for 49 years like I have, And if I decided tomorrow that, oh, now I'm infallible, now I've resolved all of my psychology, I don't need to look anymore, what would happen? My ego would be dancing on the tables. Now I've got him. Now he's stuck. Now he's really stuck, because nobody is more stuck than the ones who are not looking for the prison cell with the chains. They think they're outside the prison. They're not chained anymore. And that's why I'm saying, when you let go of this self that wants you to be infallible, you don't need to think anymore that you reach some ultimate state of consciousness. You don't need to think you're enlightened, you're awakened, you're ego-free, you have no self. You don't need to think this way. That means you can keep looking into your subconscious mind, see these very subtle subconscious selves that come up. And therefore you keep making progress until you get to that point where, as I've explained in a breakthrough video about 144 levels of consciousness, you're at the highest level of consciousness you can reach on earth. Then you're ready to ascend, because now there's nothing in your subconscious mind that pulls you back to earth. No attachments, nothing left undone, nothing to do, nothing to experience. You can look at earth, give it one last look and say, I'm out of here. I'm ready to move on. And then you can ascend, and then you can keep growing from there. It's not that the ascension means that now you're not growing anymore. There's always growth up until a greater consciousness, as I've explained. So, what I'm trying to say with this video is, if you're a spiritual person, if you really want to make spiritual progress, you can look at this in yourself. What resistance do I have? What cognitive dissonance do I have that, for example, says, oh, I'm an advanced spiritual person, and therefore I can't have unresolved psychology, for example, and therefore I don't need to look. Then you can realize these are two subconscious selves projecting. You're an advanced spiritual student, you must be infallible, therefore you couldn't have unresolved psychology. Is there another self projects, if you are advanced, you can't have unresolved psychology. And there may be a third one that projects, you don't need to look at your psychology. That's below you. You've gone beyond that point. You can look at this, and then you can see these are subconscious selves. And they are what creates the constant tension in your mind. And if you like the tension and you want to keep going with that, okay. If you really like the sense that you are an advanced spiritual student, or an advanced spiritual teacher for that matter, you can keep going with that. I have no problem with that. I respect your free will. If you need to have that experience longer than you've had it so far, I don't have a problem with that. But then you obviously don't need me and these teachings. So I'm assuming that if you're listening to this, it's because you actually want to make spiritual progress. And that's what I'm saying. You can come to consciously look for the very resistance in your own mind. That is like these boat anchors dragging behind you, preventing you from climbing the hill or the spiral staircase. And so you can come to consciously look at these, see them, let them go. And I guarantee you, once you let this resistance go, gosh, you're going to feel so much more at peace about yourself, about your spiritual path, but also about being in this world, on this very difficult planet we're on. Everything will shift. Everything will gain a different perspective. And what will happen is that, once you start seeing these selves and how they're based on, some of these selves are based on one dualistic polarity and some on another dualistic polarity, you can see the contradictions. And that's when you start seeing through the duality consciousness. So you could say, you can come to see, you have one separate self that predicts, oh, you're an advanced spiritual student, you're always right, there can't be anything wrong with you. You may have another dualistic self that predicts, but if there is the slightest thing wrong with you and your viewpoints and your beliefs, you're not an advanced spiritual student, you are the worst kind of student that could possibly be. And when you see that, they can't both be true, right? I mean, they really can't both be true. They're completely contradictory. You're either up there or you're down there. And that's when you can then, the conscious you can then step back and say, gosh, but they're both not true. It's not that one is true and the other is untrue. They are both illusions because they're in a polarity. They're in a dualistic polarity. They're relative to each other. And the alternative is to reach for what I call the one mind, the Christ mind, where you step outside of the dualistic polarity and you just see that both dualistic polarities are wrong. They're unreal, they're illusions. And that's when you can start really unraveling the dualistic selves that you have in your subconscious mind. And once you start seeing it, it's like you pulled the plug, you know? And they're just going to start coming up. Why? Well, this is one of the really fun realizations you can come to on a spiritual path, right? So what did I say? My ego wanted me to believe I was a very advanced spiritual student, that I basically had it all figured out, and that I really didn't have any major problems in my subconscious mind. And as long as I believed this, the ego could feel secure and it could stay hidden. I didn't realize this came from my ego. I thought, oh yeah, I want to be an advanced spiritual student. It's me who wants to be an advanced spiritual student. Right, so the ego felt secure because it was hidden from me. But once I started seeing the ego, seeing the dualistic selves and the opposite viewpoints, what happened? Now the ego felt threatened. And you see, when the ego is threatened, it can't leave well enough alone. It can't leave you alone. So you pull oneself. You pull the rug from that self because you see the illusion, you let it go. So the ego knows it's lost some hold over you. And the ego, if it was smart, it could sort of just step back and say, okay, we'll just let him stay there. But the ego can't, because it has to try and reestablish its control over you. And that means it now activates another subconscious self that suddenly comes up and starts projecting into your mind a certain belief. And that means you now have an opportunity to look at that self, unmask that, see that, let it go. What's going to happen? Oh, the ego is going to feel more threatened. So it activates a third self. And it keeps doing this. You see what I'm saying here? As long as the ego is the sleeping dragon in the cave because it has you under its control, it feels secure. The moment you awaken the dragon, it can only do one thing: spew fire at you, namely these subconscious selves. And that is why some people have gone through this very difficult experience where they felt like they have an awakening experience, but then after that they go through this very difficult period that they feel like the dark night of the soul, which is a concept that's becoming more common out there. Because now they're being challenged by these subconscious selves that want to beat them back into submission, where they're asleep, when they're not looking. It's also why some people, instead of going through the dark night of the soul, they go through what we might call the bright day of the soul, where the soul thinks, oh, now I'm ego-free, now I'm enlightened, now I'm awakened. I had such a dramatic experience. And that's because the subconscious self will protect, yes, yes, you're ego-free, you don't need to look at us anymore. Don't look into the subconscious mind. Just look at the eternal sunshine of the, what is it, some kind of mind. So you see what I'm saying here. If you really understand this dynamic, that the ego is born out of duality and can only think through duality, that means that when you really see this, yes, your ego is going to feel threatened, but it is a tremendous opportunity to expose the dualistic elements that will come up, these dualistic selves that will come up. They'll keep coming up. And if you're aware of this, you can just dispense with them one at a time or two at a time sometimes when you see the polarity. And you make tremendous progress. You make more progress than you've ever done before once you turn this corner. So I hope that this has helped you turn that corner. Because this is really my goal for these. I read some of the comments on my non-duality videos, and it seems like some people think, oh, I'm just out to prove these other non-dual teachers wrong. But that's not what I'm trying to do. I am actually trying to help the people who are trapped in this non-dualistic quagmire turn this corner where they start seeing that you cannot attain a non-dual state of consciousness without looking at the dualistic elements in your consciousness. And once you start doing that and you become willing to do it, and you really see what they are, you can make so much faster progress. And you can, instead of being stuck and becoming more and more tense, you can become more and more free and more at peace.